You mentioned the security guarantees that President Trump has given in effect, and some of his aides have said this is an Article 5 guarantee, which in a way is the next best thing to Ukraine joining NATO. Because what Trump is saying is if Russia attacks Ukraine after any peace deal is done, then US will respond. And de facto, other NATO countries will respond. So I think that is really, really positive and will underwrite any long-term peace deal. When it comes to having a peace enforcement force to enforce that peace deal, the UK leading with France and others have suggested that they are planning and willing to put troops on the ground in Ukraine, which is essential. I don't think we'll see any American troops on the ground. What we need, as you say, is the American backstop, their overwhelming air power, their fighter jets and drones, etc., which far outnumber and outmatch anything that Russia has. That's important. I think this peace enforcement force will also need American intelligence and American logistics. But as far as boots on the ground goes, within European NATO countries, there are plenty of tanks and attack helicopters and infantry soldiers who could deploy to Ukraine. And we understand a lot of work has been done on this, led by Britain and France and others, to make sure that those troops are available. They need to be light and agile troops, but they need to provide a deterrence, a significant deterrence, so that Putin does not try and transgress them. But it will require significant numbers, I think, of coalition of the willing European NATO country troops in Ukraine, supported by air power, supported by intelligence. But what it shows, I think, is that the West is absolutely behind Ukraine and President Zelensky. And really, it's, as they all said yesterday, it's up to Putin. He needs to come and have a meeting with Zelensky and thrash out the deals of a peace deal, because it would appear now that Trump is firmly behind Ukraine, and hopefully this is the catalyst that we need to get a just peace deal for Ukraine that satisfies the Ukraine people who've been under this illegal and devastating assault from Russia for over 3.5 years now.
Also, the head of the British Army is traveling to the United States today for negotiations, talks about the US involvement in security guarantees for Ukraine. How do you see the main possible scenarios of this US involvement and the main security guarantee for the deployment of Western troops to Ukraine? Would it be just air police zone, air patrolling area, or also ground deployment on the front lines or behind the front lines in the Western Ukraine, for example?
Well, the critical thing, it needs to be a deterrence. It needs to be a sufficient deterrence so that when Putin looks, he sees the conventional force that he doesn't want to go up against. Unfortunately, when he looked west on the 24th of February 2022, he didn't see a conventional deterrence in Europe. And that's what this is all about. I think the Americans will provide the backstop. They'll provide the backstop of air power. They will continue to provide the intelligence that's so important to be able to patrol this peace enforcement force. But I do think that certainly the air will be controlled by European NATO fighter jets, and there are plenty of them to do that. But I think also NATO will have to put troops on the ground. And British Prime Minister Keir Starmer has already said that Britain is willing to put troops on the ground in order to police. We have a 900-mile contact line between Russian and Ukraine forces. In order to police that effectively, there'll need to be a lot of surveillance assets, not only drones, but satellites and no doubt fighter jets as well. But I think you also need a very mobile force that can move quickly to any areas that there might be Russian incursions, and with enough firepower and military heft to knock it back straight away. But primarily, this NATO peace enforcement force is not there to fight the Russians. it's there to deter them. But if the deterrence fails, it needs enough firepower to be able to defeat any Russian force that it would. But I think one considers that the Russian army is in a pretty terrible state at the moment. We know they've lost over 1 million casualties and over 5,000 tanks. And the British Ministry of Defence intelligence assessment yesterday said that if the Russians carried on with this war and wanted to take the whole of the Donbass, which is the area that Putin is asking to be given up, it would probably take them 4 years, and it would probably require another 1 million Russian casualties. So I think when we look at it in the round, Western forces are far more advanced and far more capable than the Russians, and but a peace enforcement force will no doubt have to have European NATO troops on the ground in Ukraine, making sure that the Russians stay exactly where they are.
You just mentioned about Putin's demands on the Donbass. Russian dictator Vladimir Putin is ready to end the war in Ukraine in exchange for Ukraine giving up the whole Donbass, exactly those areas and those regions which Russia couldn't capture with its own forces on the ground. From your perspective, is there a chance that Vladimir Putin would make a concession and would change his mind and agree to a peace deal on the current front lines, because President Zelensky is not ready to give up the whole Donbass, exactly also this belt of fortress and defense lines there?
Well, one would hope so. And now that the Americans and the European countries have demonstrated and flexed their military might, one would hope that would be enough for Putin to change his mind. The Donbass is hugely symbolic, obviously for Ukraine, but also for Russia. And I suppose, from Putin's perspective, he's told his people he's going to take the whole of Ukraine. And maybe he feels that if he could at least get the Donbass, that might be a satisfaction. But as you'll know far better than I, there are over 200,000 Ukrainian people living in the area that Putin wants, and one assumes that they don't want to live under Russian control. It's a big industrial area. There are a lot of rare earth minerals, which are the sort of super currency of raw materials for the future, which no doubt Putin has his eye on. And I agree with the former head of the MI6 Russian desk, Christopher Steele, that even if there is a ceasefire and a peace deal, Putin will still consider further attacks. And of course, if he had the whole of the Donbass, his ability to strike deep into Ukraine would be that much easier than it is at the moment. So it seems a pretty unreasonable ask from Putin, but it's really up to the coalition of the willing, the European military countries, and Trump to really say that is just not on. And one will have to see when Putin and President Zelensky meet, hopefully in the near future.
You just also mentioned about the Donbass. According to the Wall Street Journal, European allies during the recent meeting with President Trump were telling President Trump that this demand of Vladimir Putin to take the whole Donbass is not credible and is not appropriate, because right now Ukraine holds really strong defense lines in the Donbass, the belt of fortress, and Russia was not able to capture these defense lines. Russia was struggling to move forward against these defense lines because of the such strong Ukraine defense forces there and this defense fortified cities. From your perspective, do you feel that Putin right now is trying to achieve the capturing the whole Donbass using diplomatic means because his army was not able to do so with military means?
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think there's any indication that Putin anytime soon could take the Donbass. And I said the the UK military assessment was it would take him at least 4 years to do that. So it seems incongruous that he is trying to use that as a bargaining chip. I mean, is he going to give back the whole of Zaporizhzhia and Kherson as a sort of quid pro quo? Doesn't seem to be suggesting that at all at the moment. But I think it also underwrites, and this is really important, and let's hope that this is understood in the White House and elsewhere, that Putin still doesn't really show any inclination of wanting to stop fighting at the moment, and demands like handing over the Donbass that he suggested really underwrite that fact. And that's why, with the military power now on display from Europe and the US, hopefully President Zelensky is in a much stronger position to negotiate with the Russians, rather than having to cede some territory which the Russians are never going to capture through military means anyway.
Let's also cover the recent summit between Putin and Trump in Alaska. Russian dictator Putin looked uncomfortable when journalists, reporters shouted questions ahead of these talks. He also made some interesting faces. What is your assessment of Putin's behavior during this summit in Alaska?
Well, you're right. He certainly looked uncomfortable, and so he should. I mean, people were shouting from the audience of whether Putin was going to stop killing children in Ukraine, and we know that Putin understands English pretty well, speaks very good English, where of course there are not many. Certainly, President Trump and not many of his people speak Russian. It was. For Putin, it was an important meeting, and that's why he attended, because it gave him international credence. He'd been a pariah on the world stage for really ever since he invaded Ukraine. In effect, Trump inviting him to Alaska gave him some credibility. And of course, he is an indicted war criminal. The International Criminal Court want to charge him for the war crimes of stealing Ukraine children. So, he should have been arrested and put in jail and put in front of the court. But he realized that the Americans weren't going to do that. But he looked pretty uncomfortable. And the fact that they didn't take any questions really sort of underlined that. And not a great deal came out of it, although it did seem to stimulate the meeting between Zelensky and European leaders in the White House that we just saw yesterday. So this is the beginning, I suppose, of the discussions between East and West. And let's hope next time that Putin comes to meet President Zelensky and President Trump, he has a little bit more to offer and realizes that the only way forward is a just peace in Ukraine, and that should happen as soon as possible.
Don't you think that this uncomfortable condition for Vladimir Putin in Alaska, don't you think that his isolation was the reason why he felt uncomfortable in Alaska during this press conference meeting with Trump, when reporters were shouting questions?
Well, absolutely. Putin is not used to being shouted at. He's not used to being outside the very close confines of the Kremlin and his staff. Nobody in Russia questions him at all. The media, that's what it is. Most of it is sponsored by the Russian government. Only pour praise on Putin. So to hear being criticised and actually for him, it was probably very good that perhaps Putin is so cocooned in the Kremlin, he doesn't realize that the rest of the world is talking about him and talking about him as a murderer. He now probably gets that feeling, because I'm sure his staff don't tell him, and that's why he looks so uncomfortable and ill at ease, and good riddance to him.
He also looked sad after this meeting with Trump, after this first moment when he met Trump. He looked sad also after when reporters shouted this question about when would Vladimir Putin stop killing civilians in Ukraine. Do you feel that this was the first time when Putin realized that many people in the West just hate him because of his war crimes in Ukraine. And how could this evolve in the future? How could this feeling evolve in him?
Well, I mean, this is a complex issue. I expect hitherto President Trump and his close advisors have seemed to be closer to the Kremlin and Putin than they were to President Zelensky and Kyiv. So maybe Putin was expecting something a little bit better and a little bit more. So I think that's why he was pretty shocked and looked pretty shocked. It's probably a really stark realization, and I expect with Kremlin advisors saying that any meeting is a couple of weeks away and they want a lot of other pre-meetings with junior staff, it's maybe Putin has suddenly realized that actually things are getting really serious, and President Trump's run out of patience with him, and the Europeans are absolutely behind Ukraine. So it might be a salutary lesson to Putin that, perhaps his number is up, and he wants to elongate it, which is why I suppose in a way he's given the impression he wants to keep on fighting, because actually now that America and Europe is turning the military screw, he might see that his end is coming rather quicker than he anticipated a few weeks ago.
Let's also cover the upcoming summit between President Zelensky, Vladimir Putin, and President Trump. From your perspective, how can Vladimir Putin look at President Zelensky's eyes? How would it be possible for Putin to speak with President Zelensky, to look at his eyes, and could Vladimir Putin be ashamed during this meeting?
Well, absolutely he should be very ashamed, all the civilians he's killed in Ukraine. But I think we're getting to know that Putin is not like the rest of us. I don't think he has the same sort of mental aptitude and the ability to really feel guilty. He seems to have very few morals or scruples. We've seen the war crimes he's committed. We've discussed before the war crimes of using chemical weapons that he's still doing on an industrial scale in Ukraine, and all the attacks he's ordered on schools and hospitals in Ukraine. Unfortunately, this is somebody who seems to be unconcerned by his moral compass. He's an ex-spy, and his absolute desire is to be the sort of modern Russian Tsar, conquering everything in front of him. So I don't think we're going to see or expect any humility from Putin. But let's hope he has at least got the moral courage to meet President Zelensky so that we can try and move these things forward. But when you have no morals or scruples, there's almost no limits to what you're prepared to do. And so far, that's what we've seen from President Putin. And that's how he must be treated. One always is taught to treat people as you would have them treat yourself. But in Putin's case, I don't think that is a realistic notion. And the only thing that Putin really understands is strength and exploits weakness. So I think the West and the US must show absolute strength and support to Ukraine in order that President Zelensky can get a just peace deal for the people of Ukraine.